A kitchen table, a single overhead light. A woman's hand smooths a $20 bill flat against the wood, right beside a grocery list written in pencil. It is a Tuesday morning in 1962, and that $20 bill has a job to do before the week is finished. It has to buy food. It has to cover what breaks. It has to leave something behind for whatever nobody saw coming. She looks at it the way you might look at a full tank of gas before a long drive, wondering exactly how far it will actually take her. By the end of this video, you'll know exactly what that same $20 could buy in 1962, and exactly what it would take to buy the same thing today. The answer isn't just about prices, it's about something almost every household has quietly lost since then. If you enjoy discovering how ordinary families managed money before spending apps and credit cards did it for them, subscribe, because this $20 bill has a longer story than you'd expect. In 1962, an ordinary American household ran on a single income far more often than it does today, and that income arrived quite literally as cash in an envelope or folded into a coat pocket, rather than as numbers glowing on a screen somewhere. A woman managing a household budget in that era wasn't checking a banking app before making a decision. She was looking at actual paper and actual coins, watching the pile shrink in front of her with every choice she made that week. $20 for many working families represented a meaningful slice of a week's earnings, not loose pocket change to be tossed around without thought. It had to stretch across groceries, household basics, the occasional repair, and whatever emergency the week happened to produce without warning. There was no swipe, no tap, no automatic bill pulling quietly from an account somewhere in the background while nobody was watching it happen. Every dollar that left that house left because someone, almost always the woman managing the household, made a deliberate, conscious decision to let it go. That single difference, cash you can physically see and count versus money that moves invisibly through a system, shaped nearly everything about how an ordinary family approached spending in that decade. It's worth holding on to that difference clearly as we move forward, because by the end of this story, it may turn out to matter considerably more than the prices themselves ever did. The $20 started the week whole, uncommitted, full of a kind of quiet possibility, the way any beginning tends to be. Before a single dollar left the house, it had already been mentally divided, almost the way a farmer divides a field before planting anything at all. A portion for food, a portion held loosely in reserve for whatever might break, a portion that, if the week went well, might make it all the way to Sunday untouched. This mental division wasn't written down anywhere formal in most households, not at first. It lived mostly in the head of whoever was managing it, refined week after week through nothing more than plain repetition and the occasional hard lesson learned the difficult way. But it wasn't going to stay whole for long, and the very first place that $20 faced a real test wasn't a bill, and it wasn't an emergency. It was the grocery store, waiting patiently just a few blocks away, the way it waited every single week without fail. Imagine an ordinary American family of four managing their weekly grocery run with careful, practiced attention given to every single item that made its way into the basket. Bread, milk, a dozen eggs, a modest cut of meat chosen as much for how far it could stretch as for how it tasted. Seasonal produce picked because it happened to be at its cheapest that particular week, and a handful of pantry staples, flour, rice, dried beans, canned goods meant to outlast this single trip and carry the family well into the following week. Prices in 1962 varied considerably by region, by the specific store, and by the exact brand or cut chosen, so no single number can honestly capture the entire national experience. But historically speaking, a family shopping with real care in that era could realistically cover several days of basic, filling meals for a household of four, using somewhere in the range of half to two-thirds of a $20 weekly budget, with the remaining portion depending heavily on what was already sitting on the pantry shelf left over from the week before. What made a grocery trip like this genuinely work wasn't primarily about the prices printed on the shelf. It was about what the family chose not to buy at all. A woman managing that grocery list wasn't filling her cart with convenience because convenience, in the modern sense we understand it today, largely didn't exist yet as a category to purchase. She was filling it with ingredients built to become more than one single meal. A roasted chicken bought on Sunday wasn't simply Sunday's dinner and nothing more. It was Monday's sandwiches, and by Tuesday, whatever remained on the bones had usually found its way into a simple soup, stretched deliberately across 3 separate days, instead of disappearing in one sitting, the way it so easily could have. Bread purchased fresh on a Tuesday was generally expected to last until Friday, and if it began to go slightly stale before then, it rarely went straight into the trash. It became the base for something else entirely, a bread pudding, a simple stuffing, a way of squeezing one more use out of something that hadn't technically gone to waste yet. Produce was chosen almost entirely based on what happened to be in season that particular month, because anything out of season commanded a price premium that a genuinely careful shopper in that decade avoided without a second thought, the way you'd avoid stepping in a puddle you could clearly see coming. Canned goods were purchased with a careful eye toward what the pantry shelf already held at home, rarely duplicated simply because something looked momentarily appealing while standing in that particular aisle. By the time the entire grocery basket had been fully accounted for at the register, a meaningful portion of the original $20 was already gone for the week. But what remained afterward in that pantry, the extra portions, the ingredients deliberately chosen because they carried more than one use ahead of them, represented a kind of value that the paper receipt alone could never fully capture on its own. The grocery bill looked manageable enough by the time she walked back through her own front door, but groceries were never the only thing quietly competing for that $20. One broken item, one unexpected repair showing up out of nowhere could shift the entire shape of the week without a moment's warning. Somewhere in nearly every ordinary household budget of that era, something eventually broke, the way something in every household eventually does. And how a family responded to that particular moment said as much about their finances as any grocery list ever could hope to. Picture a housewife sitting at that same kitchen table on a Wednesday evening, a torn shirt collar spread out flat in front of her under the lamp, a needle and a length of thread in her hand instead of another shopping list. In 1962, replacing a damaged item outright wasn't the automatic first response it so often is today. It was closer to a last resort, something only seriously considered after every reasonable attempt at repair had already been tried and had genuinely failed. A pair of children's shoes with a worn-through sole went to a local cobbler rather than straight into the trash bin, a repair that historically cost only a fraction of what a brand-new pair would have demanded from that same limited budget. A wobbling kitchen chair usually needed nothing more than a single tightened screw, not a trip to the furniture store. A small appliance that had stopped working correctly often got opened up and examined closely at that same kitchen table before anyone in the house assumed it was truly finished for good. This repair-first instinct wasn't simply frugality practiced for its own sake, some rigid rule followed without thought. It reflected a much broader financial reality sitting underneath the entire household. Replacing something cost real, immediate cash, pulled directly from an already limited and carefully planned budget. Repairing something, by comparison, usually cost only time, and time, whatever other hardships a particular household happened to be facing that year, was very often a resource families still had considerably more of than spare cash. The emotional weight of this habit mattered too, in a way that's easy to overlook from a distance of more than 60 years. Sitting down to mend a torn shirt collar wasn't generally treated as some special burden or unusual hardship worth complaining about. It was simply Wednesday. It was simply part of keeping a household running smoothly, connected directly and quietly to that very same $20 budget sitting untouched on the kitchen table. Every single dollar not spent replacing something that could clearly still be fixed remained a dollar that stayed available for whatever the rest of that particular week still had waiting in store. The family had stretched the groceries as far as they reasonably could and repaired what needed repairing without much complaint, but there was still the quieter question of protecting whatever money actually remained, and that question, as it turned out, had its own careful answer. Physical cash created a kind of built-in resistance that modern spending has almost entirely lost somewhere along the way. In many households of that decade, whatever money remained after groceries and repairs didn't simply sit loose inside a purse or a coat pocket, freely available for whatever happened to catch the eye at the next store window walked past. It frequently went into a labeled envelope or a small tin kept tucked away on a high kitchen shelf, sorted carefully by purpose: one envelope for savings, one for an upcoming known expense, one for a small reserve set aside for whatever the week hadn't yet revealed. A household ledger, often nothing more than a simple notebook with two plain columns, one for what came in and one for what went back out, frequently sat inside a kitchen drawer, updated regularly enough that a family generally knew, without needing to calculate anything especially complicated, exactly how much room remained in their week at any given moment. This friction, the simple physical act of opening an envelope, counting out actual bills by hand, watching a clearly labeled pile grow noticeably smaller with every decision made, created a natural pause that modern spending frequently skips over entirely without anyone even noticing it's gone. A subscription today renews automatically without a single fresh decision being made that particular month at all. A card payment completes in well under a second, with no physical reminder afterward of exactly what remains once it's done. None of this is meant to suggest that people living in 1962 were somehow inherently more disciplined by nature than people are today. It simply means the everyday tools available to them built a small, deliberate delay directly into the act of spending itself. A delay that made overspending by pure accident considerably harder to do without noticing. A woman deciding whether to dip into her household's small protected reserve had to physically retrieve it, count it out by hand, and make a fully conscious decision to reduce it. 3 entirely separate moments where she could still reconsider, in a process that modern convenience today would complete in under a single second, with no pause built in at all. The family had stretched the money about as far as it could reasonably go, repaired what genuinely needed repairing, and carefully protected whatever remained afterward. But there was still one question that $20 bill simply couldn't answer on its own, not until we brought it forward and set it down next to today. Comparing 1962 purchasing power directly to 2026 isn't nearly as simple as plugging a single number into an online inflation calculator and reading off whatever result appears on the screen. There are actually several distinct ways to make this kind of comparison, and they don't always agree with each other nearly as cleanly as you might expect. A basic general inflation adjustment measures how the overall cost of a broad, mixed basket of everyday goods has changed across time, which does give a reasonable general sense of scale on the surface. But actual purchasing power, meaning what that money could genuinely buy in real everyday life, depends considerably more on which specific categories you happen to be looking at, because not everything has become more expensive at anywhere near the same rate over these past 60-some years. Groceries, housing, healthcare, and education have generally climbed considerably faster over this stretch than overall inflation figures alone would suggest at first glance, while certain manufactured goods, consumer electronics being perhaps the clearest and most obvious example, have in some specific cases actually become relatively cheaper across that same span of decades once you account for what they can now actually do. This distinction matters enormously if we want an honest comparison rather than a simplified one. Simply saying that $20 in 1962 is worth roughly some fixed number of dollars today, based purely on a general inflation calculation, tells only part of a much larger, more complicated story. A family in 2026 spending a considerably larger sum on groceries, household basics, and the occasional repair is very likely facing a noticeably tighter squeeze overall than a family in 1962 ever faced spending $20 across those exact same categories, precisely because food costs and housing-adjacent costs have consistently outpaced general, broad inflation by a meaningful margin over these past several decades. Understanding this particular nuance is essential before making any confident claim at all about what has genuinely changed between these two very different economic eras. And it's a distinction that gets lost far too often in quick, oversimplified comparisons. The grocery bill looked manageable enough by the time she walked back through her own front door. But groceries were never the only thing quietly competing for that $20. One broken item, one unexpected repair showing up out of nowhere, could shift the entire shape of the week without a moment's warning.
If you genuinely tried to recreate that same 1962 grocery basket and that same modest repair budget within 2026, the broad categories themselves would still look remarkably familiar on paper, but the actual pressure points inside that budget would have shifted considerably from where they once sat. Groceries today claim a noticeably larger overall share of a comparable household budget than they did back in 1962, driven directly by food price increases that have generally outpaced wage growth for a meaningful portion of American households over these past several decades. Household supplies follow a strikingly similar pattern, often costing more today, not just in raw dollar terms, but relative to what an equivalent hour of ordinary work actually earns in return. Repairs, interestingly enough, tell a somewhat more complicated and mixed story than groceries do. Some repairs, particularly anything involving modern electronics or increasingly complex home appliances, have become considerably more expensive to perform, or in a growing number of cases, simply unavailable altogether, because many manufacturers today intentionally design products to eventually be replaced rather than repaired, unlike the simpler, more mechanical goods that were common in 1962 and that a determined, patient household could very often fix entirely on their own kitchen table. But the single biggest difference sitting inside a genuinely comparable modern budget isn't any one category quietly increasing in price. It's the presence of entirely new categories of spending that simply didn't meaningfully exist inside a typical 1962 household budget at all. Recurring monthly subscriptions, convenience purchases built specifically around saving time rather than meeting any genuine underlying need. Small automatic charges that individually feel almost too insignificant to notice, yet collectively claim a very real portion of a modern household's monthly spending without ever once requiring a single deliberate, conscious decision to be made. A 2026 household genuinely attempting to recreate a 1962-style weekly budget would very likely discover that groceries and housing-adjacent costs squeeze considerably harder than they once did, while an entirely new category of quiet, automatic spending simultaneously competes hard for whatever modest room happens to remain afterward.
The surprising part of this entire story was never really that $20 happened to be worth more back in 1962. Nearly everyone already understands, at least in general terms, that prices were lower back then. The genuinely surprising question, the one worth actually sitting with for a moment, is what happens to money in the space between the moment it's first earned and the moment it eventually gets spent, and why so many households today can earn considerably more in real adjusted terms while still somehow ending most months feeling like there's noticeably less left over to show for it. The honest lesson buried inside this entire comparison isn't simply that everything happened to be cheaper back in 1962, because in a great many meaningful ways, everyday life back then was also considerably harder, with fewer conveniences available, fewer safety nets in place, and considerably less overall flexibility than most households have reasonably come to expect and rely on today. The real lesson here is about what actually happened to a single dollar in the space between the moment it entered a household and the moment it finally left again. In 1962, nearly every dollar that came into a household had a specific, deliberate job already assigned to it well before it was ever actually spent. Cash itself was visible and countable, which naturally made spending a conscious, weighed act rather than something passive that simply happened on its own. Repair was the automatic default response whenever something broke, not replacement. Reuse extended the practical life of ordinary household items considerably longer than most modern households would even think to attempt today without a second thought. Recurring automatic expenses were essentially non-existent as a category, which meant a much smaller overall share of household income was already spoken for and committed before a single deliberate decision was ever consciously made by anyone in that home. So let's return, one final time, to that original $20 sitting on the kitchen table exactly where this entire story first began. In 1962, that $20 could realistically cover several days of solid filling groceries for a family of 4, comfortably absorb one small household repair without ever requiring a fresh trip to a store for something entirely new, and still leave a modest amount safely set aside for whatever the rest of that particular week hadn't yet revealed, all without a single automatic payment or recurring charge quietly claiming its own share before anyone had made a single deliberate choice about it. Adjusted broadly using a general inflation calculation, that same $20 would represent somewhere in the range of roughly $170 to $200 in 2026 terms, though, as we've already seen clearly throughout this story, that broad adjustment realistically tells only part of a much larger picture. genuinely recreating the actual purchasing power of that original $20, specifically for groceries and basic household needs, given exactly how those particular categories have risen over these past decades, would very likely require a noticeably higher figure than a general inflation calculation alone would ever suggest on its own, precisely because food costs and everyday household costs have consistently climbed faster than the broader national average over this same long stretch of time. The honest answer here was never really a single dramatic number designed purely to shock or impress. It's the quieter recognition that the very same $20 asked to do that exact same specific job today would face a considerably tighter squeeze than it ever did back then. Not only because prices themselves have genuinely risen, but because so many new, quiet, largely invisible claims on a modern household's money simply didn't exist at all back in that particular decade. There is one more thing worth sitting with before we leave that kitchen table for good. The habits we've walked through today weren't unique to any single household, and they certainly weren't unique to any single decade either. They were simply easier to practice when the tools available made them the natural default, rather than something requiring extra effort to maintain. Nobody in 1962 needed a course, an app, or a specialist to teach them how to give $1 a job. The system around them, visible cash, physical envelopes, a repair shop on nearly every corner, quietly encouraged those habits without anyone needing to think especially hard about it. Today, the tools around us tend to encourage the opposite by default: frictionless spending, effortless replacement, subscriptions that renew themselves without a single fresh decision. The habits themselves haven't disappeared because people today are somehow less capable or less careful. They've simply become harder to practice by accident, which means they now require a level of deliberate intention that 1962 rarely demanded in the same way. Picture that same kitchen table one final time. The $20 bill is gone now, fully spent across groceries, one small necessary repair, and whatever modest amount was carefully protected away in an envelope for later use. But what that $20 actually represented was never only the paper itself, never only the specific number printed across its face. It was planning, done deliberately well before the week had even properly begun. It was restraint, the simple, repeated choice not to buy the bigger box or the shinier new item purely because it happened to be sitting right there on the shelf. It was resourcefulness, finding a genuine second and sometimes even a third use for something before ever quietly considering it finished and done. It was the simple, repeated decision, made over and over without much fanfare, to make something last just a little longer than it strictly had to. None of that required real poverty to practice, and none of it required any real nostalgia for a decade that carried its own very real difficulties alongside whatever simplicity it also offered. It required only the steady habit of giving every single dollar a specific, deliberate job before it ever left your hand, a habit that becomes considerably easier to build and maintain when the money sitting in front of you is something you can actually see, physically count, and genuinely watch shrink, one deliberate decision at a time, rather than something that quietly disappears from a screen somewhere while you're busy thinking about something else entirely. If you were handed $20 right now and told it had to manage your entire household for one full week, what would you choose to spend it on first, and what would you deliberately choose to leave out? Tell us in the comments below, and subscribe for more forgotten household stories like this one, the kind that quietly explain more about money than most modern advice ever manages to.